Hello, everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review. Starting this evening in Miami, a disheartening end to an international tragedy. 2 weeks have now passed since the Champlain Towers South condo collapsed, rescue workers essentially ending their efforts.
At this point, we have truly exhausted every option available to us in the search and rescue mission. So today is about beginning the transition to recovery so that we can help to bring closure to the families who've been suffering and waiting for news. Nothing we can do can bring back those we've lost, but we can and we will do everything in our power possible to identify all of the victims and to offer closure to the families in this time of unimaginable grief.
The announcement today comes as a result of a consensus by those closest to the rescue efforts that the possibility of someone still alive is near zero. They are probably right, but in the end, God is still in charge, and while there seems to be no chance of finding life in the rubble, a miracle is still possible.
Moments of silence, shared prayers and stories, and candlelit vigils lighting up in Surfside, Miami, Florida. Rescue workers admitting that at this point the chance of finding a survivor is effectively nil. As it is, after initial hours of the search, not one victim pulled from the wreckage found alive. And the death toll now standing at 54, with 86 left unaccounted for. Though investigations are ongoing to confirm that those listed as missing are indeed under the rubble of the 12-story seaside condo. Meanwhile, engineers hired by the city are conducting days of tests on the nearby Champlain community towers, which were built around the same time and with similar designs. So far, though, president of the Champlain Towers North Condo Association, Naum Lusky, is insisting that everything is fine. For the South Towers, on the other hand, a grand jury investigation into the collapse has been launched, and at least half a dozen lawsuits have been filed by the victims' families.
My sister and my brother-in-law are in that building right now. You'd never expect to be put in a place like this overnight. I got the news at 3 in the morning the day of, and I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw this. You can't express what emotions you feel. Angry, you're sad. You can't express what all the families in there are going through.
God bless you, and may God give you strength.
We begin with tragic news sending shockwaves through Israel. The sudden and inexplicable deaths of 2 IDF soldiers within just 48 hours last weekend. First on Thursday, senior IDF officer Colonel Sharon Asman collapsing during routine fitness training. The 42-year-old commander of the Nachal Infantry Brigade falling to the ground while running alongside fellow commanders on base in central Israel. And emergency medical responders pronounced him dead shortly thereafter. He was promoted to brigade commander just 3 days prior to his death. Defense Minister Gantz, President Rivlin, and Prime Minister Bennett all mourning his death as heartbreaking, while lauding Asman's heroism, initiative, and humility. He's survived by his wife and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, less than a day later, 22-year-old cadet Shiley Westland also pronounced dead. Westland had suffered a yet unknown medical incident and similarly collapsed during training on Tuesday last week. Her mother, Yifat, saying that she has a hole in her heart with Shiley's shape, adding that she's praying to wake up from this nightmare. Investigations into both deaths are now underway. Moving on, IDF clashes with Palestinians rising up again. Israel retaliating against and responding to attacks from Gaza and in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. IDF aircraft overnight Thursday and then again on Saturday striking Hamas terror infrastructure in Gaza, targets allegedly including a weapons manufacturing site. And this in response to the ongoing Palestinians' use of incendiary and explosive balloons, which have burned thousands of acres over the past few years. Also, the balloons have recently returned to popularity amidst a very shaky ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Hamas, for its part, threatening to restart hostilities, including rocket fire, supposedly over incidents in Jerusalem. And Israel saying that it will respond to incendiary balloons in the same way that it responds to rockets. Moving on, Lebanon suffering from the worst economic collapse in the country's history, compounded by coronavirus, the explosion at the Beirut port last August, and what international experts are calling inadequate government action. Half the population now in poverty, as the value of Lebanon's currency falling by over 90% in the past 2 years alone. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz then now offering aid to the Lebanese, despite the technical state of hostilities between these two neighboring countries. Now, there are still no details as to what the aid might include, nor whether Lebanon would accept it. But taking to Twitter, Gantz is writing that, as an Israeli, a Jew, and a human being, his heart goes out to the hungry people of Lebanon. And Gantz adds that Israel is ready to act with assistance as it has in the past, while encouraging other countries to follow suit, especially as violence and protests are breaking out amid the breakdown in basic services in Lebanon, including massive shortages in electricity and fuel.
موجود هون ببيروت صرنا هلا نحن عم نعاني بهالفتره الازمه كثير كبيره عم تشد اكثر لقدام العالم بعد ما يعملوا حل سلمي انه يلاقوا له شيء شغله لا بالعكس كلياتنا عم نصف الطوابير مثل كانه نحن قوم حمير فمعلش سامحوني من التعبير بعد شوي حركب جوانح وطير.
The World Bank now listing Lebanon as a, quote, fragility, conflict, and violence state, meaning concerns are mounting that the conditions may soon become so dire that they risk becoming, quote, systemic national failings with regional and potentially global effects. Returning now to more local issues. Palestinian protests against Palestinian Authority President Abbas's regime still ongoing after over a week. Hundreds calling for Abbas to resign in Ramallah following the death of a popular PA critic while in police custody. And the demonstrators may actually be gaining momentum. For the first time since the demonstrations began, rallies on Saturday ended peacefully as opposed to under violent police crackdown. Both the UN and Palestinian human rights groups having condemned the PA for attacking protesters at previous rallies. However, while sparked by the death of critic Nizar Banat, the growing dissent has been building for several months, especially after the long-awaited Palestinian elections were canceled yet again. Even most Palestinians who at one time supported Abbas and his Fatah party now widely viewing the president and his faction as corrupt and autocratic. Of course, that said, there are still those who toe the party line, at least one pro-regime counter-protest popping up in Ramallah as well. Now, some good news on the coronavirus front. Israel finally reaching a trade agreement preventing the waste of well over 500,000 soon-to-expire vaccines. Just a few weeks after the Palestinian Authority reneged on their agreements and rejected coronavirus vaccines from Israel, Israel finding a viable solution for the doses, which are set to expire at the end of July before Israel can put them to proper use.
범정부 백신 도입 TF는 이번 달 7월 이스라엘 정부로부터 화이자 백신 70만 회분을 공급받고 오는 9월에서 11월까지 순차적으로 반환하는 백신 교환 협약을 오늘자로 체결하였습니다.
South Korea agreeing to accept the terms that the Palestinians flipped on, a win-win scenario where Seoul receives vaccines sooner than expected and in return provides the same amount to Jerusalem at a later time. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett explaining that the deal, quote, plugs the holes as well as ensures that Israel maintains proper vaccine stocks, end quote. And this as Jerusalem particularly concerned about the latest spike in infections. Israel confirming over 500 new cases overnight for the first time since March, half of whom are school children. Then 50,000 people are now also in quarantine. Bennett, for his part, repeating pleas for everyone over age 12 to vaccinate as soon as possible. As for concerns about the evolving variants that have made or will likely make their way around the world eventually, health experts discussing the need for booster shots, a third dose of coronavirus vaccines to shore up citizens' defenses. Israeli health ministry officials and other leaders in the medical community, however, are arguing that a third shot would only be necessary for certain individuals with compromised immune systems, if at all, and this regardless of the vaccine's drop in efficacy against new variants like the Delta variant. Meantime, Prime Minister Bennett ordering the health ministry to open 2 new medical studies that will later inform COVID policy. One study testing verified COVID patients who've been vaccinated in order to determine the vaccine's efficacy and rate at which it wears off among different medical demographics. And the other, a study of cellular immunity amongst vaxxed individuals through the use of serological testing, which checks for the number of COVID antibodies present. Moving on, Prime Minister Bennett's government put to the test late Monday night with a parliament vote on the renewing of the controversial citizenship and family reunification laws. The opposition, headed by former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, choosing politics over supposed security.
סמי אבו שחאדה, נגד. נפתלי בנט, בעד.
Likud members chanting shame at the new premier after the government failed to renew the law instated in 2003 because of the Second Intifada. The opposition leaders making their political statements through a night-long filibuster, arguing that without their right-wing support, Bennett's values would flounder in his left-wing government. And Bennett, for his part, less than impressed, saying certain issues have no room for politics.
יש נקודות שבהם בכל זאת, גם באופוזיציה, צריך לגלות אחריות לאומית. אני אומר לחבריי באופוזיציה, יש דברים שלא משחקים איתם. ביטחון המדינה הוא קו אדום, והמדינה צריכה שליטה על מי נכנס אליה ומי מתאזרח בה. הכנסת אלפי פלסטינים ואזרוח שלהם ופגיעה בביטחון המדינה בשביל עוד איזה רבע נקודה פוליטית, זה פשוט לא הדבר הנכון לעשות.
Now in other news, while Americans celebrated Independence Day on July 4th here in Israel, the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem held its annual celebrations on Tuesday night. In making remarks at the event, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who said he would challenge any attempt to make Israel a partisan issue in the United States. Let's take a look.
Israelis and Americans gathered Tuesday night at the 24th Independence Day celebrations at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett addressed the crowd in his first official speech to an American audience, thanking U.S. President Joe Biden for his commitment to Israel and reaffirming the U.S.-Israeli friendship.
Israelis across the political spectrum are fundamentally pro-American. We like America. We appreciate, we admire what you're doing out there. And that's the way it ought to be also in America vis-a-vis Israel. And I'll challenge any attempt to make America a partisan political issue in Israel and any attempt to make Israel a partisan political issue in the United States.
Bennett's statement comes at a time of increasing animosity within the U.S. Democratic Party, as numerous Democrats have been overly critical of Israel and its policies, while critics of Benjamin Netanyahu accused him of diminishing Israel's relationship with the Democratic Party during his time as Prime Minister. Yet at the embassy event, there was a strong show of solidarity between Israel and the U.S. Following Bennett on stage was Democratic Party House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Gregory Meeks, who arrived in Israel for the celebrations along with a bipartisan congressional delegation.
That the United States of America, the United States Congress, especially the United States House of Representatives, we're not here and strong with Israel because of politics. We're here because of values. And Israel and the United States and the United States Congress, we share the same values. So that is an unbreakable bond between you and us.
Meeks also had reassuring words of support for Israel regarding a number of key security issues.
So let me make it plain. We're going to lock arm in arm with you, Mr. Prime Minister, to make sure that Iran doesn't get its way. We're going to lock arm in arms with you to make sure that Hamas doesn't get its way. We're going to lock arm in arms with you to make sure that the historic moment that is upon us with the Abraham Accords, that we get more people to join and say Israel has the right to exist, and we're going to work with them hand in hand. It's a historic moment today.
Now, Israel can only hope that the warm sentiments will continue to translate into action as Bennett prepares to meet with his U.S. counterpart, President Joe Biden.
Now, as Americans marked Independence Day in the United States on Sunday, Israeli leaders from the new coalition sent their congratulations to their allies and friends across the states. One Israeli official in particular, however, missed the mark, and unfortunately in spectacular fashion. I suspect that by this time on Sunday, an intern somewhere in Israel was likely fired. In a since-deleted tweet, Israeli Foreign Minister and alternate Prime Minister Yair Lapid sending his best wishes to the United States, saying that Washington has no better friend than Jerusalem and vice versa. But there are two glaring issues with his post. First, the American flag on the bottom right, you may have noticed, is displayed upside down, which many consider to be disrespectful, especially since, according to United States flag code, this should never be done except as a sign of dire distress. Then second, in a more subtle but no less embarrassing inclusion, the small flag at the end of the text is not that of the United States at all, but rather it's that of Liberia, as pointed out on social media by eagle-eyed users. And this just days after Lapid was heavily criticized for allegedly snubbing major investors in the United Arab Emirates as well. Now, it is the 4th of July, and Americans around the world are celebrating the United States' independence. But Israelis are celebrating the anniversary of another liberation, the 45th anniversary of Operation Thunderbolt, one of the most daring and successful rescue missions ever attempted. 45 years later, and Operation Thunderbolt, aka Operation Entebbe, is still being commemorated, and for very good reason. The operation, praised by the international community for doing the impossible, remains among the most incredible, daring, and creative solutions to a high-stakes situation in world history. And Israel now releasing renewed details about the planning, execution, and aftermath of the operation, complete with an interview featuring Tamir Pardo, former director of the Israeli Mossad and veteran of the Entebbe operation, as the officer under leading operational commander and brother to former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Lieutenant Colonel Yoni Netanyahu.
תן לצה"ל משימה, הוא יודע לבצע אותה. בכל מקום על הגלובוס, בצורה מוצלחת.
It all started June 27th, 1976, when 4 Palestinians from the PFLP terror group hijacked an Air France passenger jet en route to Paris. The terrorists then diverted the plane to Entebbe, Uganda, with the support of then Ugandan President Idi Amin, all while demanding a $5 million ransom and the release of hundreds of prisoners worldwide. Upon landing in Uganda, though, the hijackers released all of the non-Jewish and non-Israeli hostages off to Paris, and they threatened to begin killing the remaining hostages within 48 hours unless all demands were met. Well, thankfully, it was actually in interviewing these released hostages that Israeli commandos were able to get a better picture of what they were up against, and with that, the rescue mission was hatched. 100 elite commandos would fly hours through enemy territory to Uganda to then impersonate President Amin's motorcade, eliminate the terrorists, liberate over 100 hostages, and cripple Uganda's ability to give chase, all in just about 90 minutes. It was a plan that would go awry within minutes of touchdown, killing lead officer Yoni Netanyahu and crippling Commando Soren Hershko, but which would nevertheless largely result in success. Meanwhile, as Israelis were beginning the operation, President Amin was himself in the Republic of Mauritius, addressing the Organization of African Unity as its outgoing chairman. In the address, Amin expressing support for the hijacking and praising himself for Uganda's supposedly humanitarian response, adding that he cut off communications with Israel for the sake of the hostages.
It was not my intention to tell the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine to bring the hostages to Uganda, but I accept to land there for the humanitarian ground. And also, there was... and it is the first time for the history of the hijackers in the world. The hostages removed from the airplane and put in comfortable place, which never happened anywhere.
It was only on his way home that Amin learned of the successful Israeli evacuation.
אני יכול רק לומר, מתוך היכרות שלי, בסך הכל השתחררתי בתוך מערכת הביטחון לפני 5 שנים. אז בכל מערכת הביטחון עשו פעילויות מדהימות, והדורות הצעירים עולים דרגות רבות על הדור שלנו.
And now the Israel Antiquities Authorities and Western Wall Heritage Foundation providing visitors to the Holy Land with a new adventure through the Western Wall tunnels, the most luxurious section unearthed in the tunnels to date. Hannah Rifkin, again, with the details.
A grandiose hall in the Western Wall tunnels just west of the Wilson's Arch and Temple Mount was discovered some time back. But over the next few weeks of summer, the section finally becoming accessible to the public. Then, combining remnants of a few time periods, including Hasmonean, Herodian, and Roman, this new tour is seriously amplifying visitor experiences through the newly discovered layer of the Jewish story. Mordechai Soli Eliav, chairman of the Western Wall Heritage Foundation, likewise saying the discovery expanding on the, quote, complexities of Jewish life during both the Hasmonean and Roman periods.
אנחנו נמצאים עכשיו בעצם בתוך אולם מפואר ששימש כטרקלין לאירוח של אנשי מועצת העיר והאורחים המכובדים שלהם לפני העלייה להר הבית. ושאלת השאלות מה עשו בו המקורות ההיסטוריים ובעיקר כתבי יוסף בן מתתיהו מאירים בפנינו את האופי של האזור הזה. יש פה בניינים ציבוריים מפוארים, והתמזל מזלנו לבקר באחד המפוארים שבהם. בניין שנבנה ככל הנראה בשנות ה-20-30 של המאה הראשונה לספירה, ובעצם שימש את מכובדי העיר.
Additionally, Wexler Bdolach explaining how furniture, while not uncovered with the structure, are believed to have included wooden reclining sofas. This belief being assumed due to the knowledge of such sofas' popularity, particularly during the Roman and Hellenistic eras, where people ate while reclining. In any case, the structure has been declared the most grand Herodian building unearthed in Jerusalem thus far, and is providing new context for the Western Wall tunnels, including how their use may have evolved over time. According to the IAA, in the last years before the Second Temple's destruction, big renovations were made, including the installation of a mikveh, or ritual bath, as it's known. This as visitors were required to purify themselves before entering the Holy Temple. The new trail set to open to the public before the coming high holidays.
Now, our final story tonight, a breakthrough in the field of human organ transplantation, hybrid animal-human organs. And they could just be the solution to both the global shortage of transplant organs as well as to the risk of implant rejection, or graft versus host disease. A team of Israeli researchers under Dr. Shachar Cohen at Beilinson Hospital revealing that they've successfully developed a pig organ with human blood vessels, where the human vessel coating is the point of contact between the graft and its recipient. And the result being an animal organ that is far less likely to be rejected by human hosts. As for how this feat was done, Cohen explains that they removed the lining of the pig organ's blood vessels and replaced them with a human layer, engineered in a lab from human placenta cells. And why placenta, you ask? Well, Cohen explains that the placenta is in fact the ideal organ, as it naturally connects to human beings by maintaining the bonds between mother and fetus. Finally, so far, the successful experiments have all been conducted ex vivo, or outside the body, and they include a hybrid heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, and more. And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.